it was to basically talk about how we have, you may have heard of Bart Ehrman, who is a biblical scholar, and he is very dismissive of the authenticity of the New Testament documents, the Gospels particularly.
Yeah.
And I was explaining how we have very good reason to believe that the Gospels are authentic. And the reasons are this, is that we have in the earliest Gospels, the earliest copies of the Gospels we have, all of them have the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John on them. There's no Gospel at all that lacks the name of the author, not one. And this contradicts Bart Ehrman, who says that really there were Gospels circulating which were anonymous and nobody really knew who wrote them, and that they later on gave the names of the authors, but they didn't really know for sure who the author was. But actually that's not true, because all of them have the names on. So clearly from the earliest time in Christian history, Matthew was known to have written Matthew's Gospel, Mark was known to have written Mark's Gospel, Luke was known to have written Luke's Gospel, and John was known to have written John's Gospel. Then the question is, well, are these copies accurate copies of the original, given that we don't have the original? Well, we know that there weren't it wasn't a rapid turnover of copies, because when a copy would be written, it would last 150 to 200 years, which is quite longer than we really think. When we think about these things, you think it might last 50 years and then it's kind of lost and then a new one is made. But no, if you've got copies, early copies which are lasting that length of time, then new copies can be checked against the earlier copy for authenticity and correctness. Further, you've got the quality of copyists. Ehrman would suggest that, well, the early copiers were very, very slipshod and didn't really pay attention to accuracy because they weren't professionals. People who wrote after Constantine became emperor, we have professional scribes, because then the church was officially accepted and they could have more professional work done. But actually, I was saying that Craig Evans, a biblical scholar, Protestant biblical scholar, has looked at vast numbers of early manuscripts, and he's found that he's looked at the handwriting and it's very professional. It's not amateurish or slipshod. It's very precise and careful. So it's clear that the copyists, whoever they were doing a very careful job when they copied the Gospels from one generation to the next, from one copy to the next.
That's referring to the New Testament copiers.
Copies of the Gospels, yes. And then when we look at, was there any disputes about who the authors of the Gospels were in the early centuries? Well, no. All the fathers unanimously affirmed that Matthew wrote St. Matthew's Gospel, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. No controversy at all. Where you do get a difference is the dates of writing. That's where the difference comes in. And we can say that what was happening there is that the fathers didn't really know exactly when a gospel was written, but they all had them fairly early, except St. John's Gospel, which many fathers saw as being written late in John's life. So that's accepted as a reasonable position to hold. John wrote as an old man. But the other ones, there's a lot of some that John wrote early, something John wrote early. But the general view is, in Western scholars today, is they're all written late. Not all scholars say that, by any means. E.P. Sanders, I think, is one who doesn't believe the Gospels were written late. But we can say they were written almost certainly before the fall of Jerusalem. In fact, before AD 62, because that's when the Acts of the Apostles was written. But that's when Paul is in captivity in Rome in AD 62. It's his first captivity there. And why does it end then, rather than with the destruction of Jerusalem? Because Jesus predicts the destruction of Jerusalem, And other prophecies are predicted in the writings of Luke. So if Luke was writing after the destruction of Jerusalem, he'd probably put it in his gospel, because it would be a great opportunity to say, look, Jesus prophesied truly that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, because look, here's what happened. But the fact that Luke does not refer to the destruction of Jerusalem is obviously because it hadn't yet happened when he wrote. Well, the destruction of Jerusalem was in AD 70. Therefore, Luke probably entered his gospel in AD 62, because that's when ended the Acts of the Apostles in AD 62, because that's when the Acts of the Apostles was written. Well, the Acts of the Apostles is written after Luke's gospel. We know that from looking at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, written to Theophilus, just like the Gospel of Luke. So, if the Acts of the Apostles is written in AD 62, then Luke's Gospel is probably written a few years before. So we're in maybe the late 50s, mid-50s, late 50s. It's traditionally, the view of scholarship today that Mark and Matthew were written before Luke's Gospel. So if we say Luke is about AD 58, then we put, depending on whether you put Mark first or second, I follow St. Augustine and put Mark second. So Mark will be written before AD 58, so put Mark at sort of AD 55, thereabouts. He's certainly, the tradition is he was a scribe of St. Peter and wrote what Peter was saying. So him in Rome in AD 55 is quite reasonable, with Peter. So he's AD 55. Matthew before that. So put Matthew around AD 50. Thus we have Jesus dying in around AD 33. And we have the first gospel less than 20 years after Jesus died, in the lifetime of the followers, all those who heard Jesus, the apostles, most of them themselves. Thus every means of affirming the truth of the Gospels by eyewitnesses who knew what Jesus actually said and did.
Yes, but obviously the letters are earlier than that, and there is something what Paul boasts about. According to my Gospel, he says.
Yes.
Yes. I think it's in Timothy there is a very succinct expression of what Jesus did. He came into the world and cast the light ray on life through the gospel. And there is that word, the gospel there, isn't there, in Timothy. I don't know whether it was first or second letter to Timothy, because there were two letters to Timothy.
So that's
so that is something like Paul's gospel, if you want to also quote beside.
So we can rely on the Gospels that we have as being early and authentic.
Right.
Authentically, so two of them, Matthew and John, we can rely on the fact that they're written by those two individuals who are therefore direct eyewitnesses of much of what Jesus said and did. Now, they're not eyewitnesses to everything. Matthew is called at a certain time. He's not there at the beginning. Mark is Peter's interpreter. He can speak of things which Matthew wouldn't have directly seen, because he got them from Peter, who was there before Matthew was called. John is early. John is called before Matthew. So, and not all of the apostles were going to be with Jesus all the time. So to have two eyewitness accounts and Mark's account by Peter, very valuable to fill us in on the details of the ministry. Luke, of course, is then gathering additional data from others. Many say from the Blessed Virgin Mary. Hence the detail in the early part of the Gospel, in the birth narrative.
After having investigated thoroughly everything, he says in the prologue.
Yes.
Yes.
And of saying there are other people have written before him. So we can see there that it's probable that Luke is the third gospel, because he refers to other narratives about Jesus' life and works, and having already been written. it's quite impressive that 2,000 years later we can look back
Yeah.
and have a great deal of confidence in what was written 2,000 years ago, much more than any other ancient writing. Now, the earliest ancient writings we have are written centuries. The copies we have of the originals, centuries after the originals were written. But in our case, this is not so.